Hi, and welcome to another podcast edition of our new podcast, rinaLAB, where we're having coffee with scientists from Austria. It's been a wonderful few episodes, and we're continuing this morning. And we have a special guest with us today, Bill Colglazier, who has a lot of expertise in science and diplomacy. So welcome to our show.
Thank you. It's very nice to be here.
We were just chatting about all the specialties that you've had through your career. Well, you want to give the audience a highlight of what you've done and what your specialty is?
Sure. I started out life as a theoretical physicist, and that's all I wanted to do when I was growing up. But I was influenced by a number of mentors, distinguished scientists, about the importance of science related to policy and society, particularly in the 1970s, issue related to how do we control nuclear weapons, how do we manage environmental challenges, how do we deal with the energy crisis. And so although after being a research scientist for several years, I took a fellowship program to actually work for the U.S. Congress for a year, sort of this interface of science and public policy and politics, and slowly then switched my career and sort of moved over full-time into that, university professor at first, and then going to the National Academy of Sciences, where my job was to oversee all of the studies that they do on public policy issues related to science and technology, then as the Science and Technology Advisor to the Secretary of State for 3 years, then as 2 years as co-chair of a committee at the United Nations on the role of science and technology and innovation for achieving sustainable development goals, and then now in my post-career being editor of a little online journal called Science and Diplomacy.
Very nice. The intersection of science and diplomacy, I hadn't really even given much thought until we started chatting about how important that is. And I imagine that your reason to make the shift in your career was to have impact. Is that what was in your heart?
I think so. I think a lot of scientists of my generation wanted to, at least were thinking about how could they use their expertise to make the world a better place, to help people not only in their own country, but also around the world. So the issues connected, first of all, for me, it was with arms control on nuclear weapons, but then it quickly evolved into the broad suite of issues, including how to help countries in the developing world to grow faster, how to use science technology as a tool, particularly between countries that may be estranged, where the governments don't get along. So I've been involved with a number of countries where science was a very useful tool for keeping dialogue open between countries. A number of my mentors were heavily involved in discussions with Soviet scientists in the period, which turned out when there were windows of opportunity diplomatically, they had a big impact on policies between the U.S. and the Soviet Union then at that time. So I became very much engaged with this whole issue of how science technology can be a very useful tool for influencing, moving diplomats, policymakers, in what we thought was the right direction to deal with some of these big challenges around the world and domestically. So most of my career has been at that interface of science and either public policy or international affairs and diplomacy.
That's really interesting. I would imagine that there's a lot of challenges in dealing with diplomats with various countries serving at the UN and at the state, Department of State, just because the decisions and the science that you bring to the table is not always received well. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. And it takes scientists, this program of bringing young scientists to get experience working in government, the one I had with the U.S. Congress back in the 1970s, but now it's a very large program and including a number of young as well as mid-career science, even professors that go in the State Department, and they really learn what it's like to, what diplomats have to deal with. And of course, diplomats in other countries, in every country they come, with what their government has told them, to press for their own national interests. But on the positive side, what I found with engaging with many countries in science and technology right now, particularly coming from the U.S., where even if countries don't like our politics, they admire our science and technology, our universities, our big high-tech companies. So every country I dealt with, the first topic they always wanted to talk about was how could they upgrade their own society's capabilities to be able to be competitive, to be successful, to be innovative, to ensure prosperity and security of their country. And they were looking at the model of the U.S. So that actually I found engaging on science technology with other countries was a very useful tool for influencing their behavior, their actions, even how they spend their own money sometimes, because they were looking at they wanted to engage with the U.S. even if they didn't agree with our government policies. But yes, you're absolutely right that countries are trying to do things for their own national interest. That's what diplomacy is all about, trying to convince the other guy that to do what you want them to do. And so that's always going to be uppermost. But I think most diplomats in the world now have recognized that science and technology are very powerful, that almost every issue they deal with, there's some aspect where scientific information, technological information is highly relevant. They have to increase the capability of their own foreign ministry, for example, to deal with these issues. They have to see what other countries are doing. So they're all quite willing now to engage and to talk about issues with it really in some cases come from science technology. The other thing that they're very much concerned with right now is that they see that these new technologies, whether it's artificial intelligence, robotics, gene editing, can actually create opportunities for societies, but they can also create great disruption. And so they're worried about how do they deal with these rapidly changing technologies, which may affect their society.
That's such interesting to think that science is this language across the world that unites people, unites different countries with a vision of improvement and opens doors of communication and dialogue even when there's disagreements in politics and whatnot. We talked everything from nuclear arms to social media, and we were discussing where, nuclear arms, there's a lot of science to try to make sure that was never used again. You talk a little bit about, what that looked like?
Sure. In the 1980s, some of the senior scientists that I worked with were heavily involved in dialogues with Soviet scientists on essentially on nuclear weapons. How do we be sure that, for one, there's not an accident where something is misinterpreted with another party? I mean, we got very close to that with the Cuban Missile Crisis. How do we prevent those sort of things? How do we try to reduce the threat that other countries perceive from our weapons and vice versa, as well as controlling incidents? So the dialogue that the U.S. and Soviet scientists, they were what we call track two outside of government dialogues. But when Gorbachev assumed power in the Soviet Union, it turned out that his key science advisors were the same Soviet scientists the Americans were working with. So they had all the things that were in the track two dialogues, the discussions, the issues, the possible solutions, had a big influence then on the policy side when there was this window of opportunity in terms of changes occurring in the leadership of the two countries. I was also involved in the renormalization relations after the renormalization relations between the U.S. and China. Actually, it's going to be the agreement, the scientific agreement between the two countries was 1979, so we have the 40th anniversary next year. I was at the U.S. National Academy of Sciences. We had an office in Beijing to help facilitate science and engagement between the U.S. and in Chinese scientists. So then we trained a lot of the Chinese scientists now who are leading the effort in China. I was heavily involved with from 2000 until relatively recently between the U.S. and Iran, where both countries, even relations were so bad, but they encouraged their scientific communities in both countries to engage. And so we had 3 or 4 workshops a year, not dealing with nuclear issues in those days, but dealing with public health issues, dealing with environmental issues, protection from earthquakes. With the U.S. and Cuba, when I was in the State Department, my deputy, who was this very talented American from Puerto Rico background, spoke fluent Spanish. We were next to the Cuba desk inside the State Department. So she was heavily involved in what became then the Obama administration, the renormalization, the arrangements with Cuba. There were a lot of scientific exchanges that were occurring before that. Where I am at the AAAS right now, there even have been some science engagement with North Korea, dealing with a volcano that's in the North Korean border with China, outfitting it with seismometers. So even when countries may be terribly estranged, even the diplomats have recognized that it can be very useful to have the scientific community at least talking with each other, that window of engagement can actually perhaps help lead to larger breakthroughs on the diplomatic side. What's unfortunate, I mean, for me right now, clearly politics is a more powerful force than science, at least in the short run. So in the case with the U.S. And Iran, I'm a big supporter of the Iran nuclear agreement. And now with the U.S. government backing out of it, it's almost ended this back-channel scientific communication between the U.S. And Iran. And I think that was really a serious mistake. So these things, there can be reversals. Same thing with the current U.S. administration with the Paris Climate Accords, the U.S. also backing out of that. I think I think these things will essentially go back. At least I hope that's the case. But it shows you that politics can have a big impact, even with the best efforts of the scientific community to help advance things. It doesn't necessarily guarantee that's the outcome. Although more recently being involved heavily with the role of science and technology innovation for the Sustainable Development Goals. It may not be on the radar screen of the U.S. government, but many countries around the world are heavily involved in trying to figure out how they can use science and technology really to accomplish all their national goals can be described in some sense within this broad sweep of the Sustainable Development Goals. So trying to help countries around the world to use their own scientific community, their technological community, engage with the advanced countries around the world. If all countries, in my view, if they utilize more scientific input into their policy making, hopefully it'll lead to more rational decisions. Doesn't guarantee it, but that's
we were talking about how there's got to be frustrations between the science and when diplomats and policymakers make decisions, because it's not always based on science. They've got so many other factors they've got to consider. So I can see where that can get frustrating at times, for sure. But at the same time, there's a lot of positive in having that connection across the world with various countries. Let's talk about social media, because I thought that was really interesting when we were chatting a little earlier about, the impacts of social media and what that's done for the community in the world.
Yeah. When I was in the State Department, I was involved with the U.S. intelligence agencies. In part, I was quite impressed with their efforts to try to anticipate what were some of the implications of sort of rapidly developing technology, and social media was one of them, trying to see how it would affect foreign relations, government policy, societies around the world. I guess my conclusion, though, now looking back what's happened more recently, particularly with the use of fake news and pretend accounts on Facebook and elsewhere to try to influence the U.S. election, that we really didn't do a very good job anticipating how social media could be used for what you might say nefarious purposes. So a little bit caught flat-footed in trying to see what was coming. So it shows you that even the best intelligence agencies, the best diplomats, the best scientists are not always can see exactly how things are going to unwind, particularly when you have these new developments.
Seems like a double-edged sword is what we were talking about earlier, because you have that, but then you also have the connectivity of the world. And so when politicians in various countries don't listen to science or whatnot, the world knows. And so that can cause pressure for more communication.
Yeah, no, absolutely. In fact, I think, and I was one of those who felt that, the combination of the internet and social media and giving a voice to people around the world, that was going to put pressure, particularly on authoritarian governments, but did not anticipate the extent to which authoritarian governments could actually use that same technology for control. I mean, you see that right now in places like China, where they're using facial recognition, to keep track of people. But I think the scientific community has a real responsibility to help policymakers, particularly in the democratic countries, understand how they can maximize the opportunities from these new technologies, but also to think very carefully about what are the challenges that we have to find ways to deal with, to defend against, if necessary. So I think that's a major challenge, not only for the science community, but for the diplomatic and political community. I was In fact, since this is talking a little bit about Austria, I've been involved with, I think, a very good organization in Austria called the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis, IASA, which is in Vienna. It was actually created in the 1970s as a way for U.S. and Soviet scientists, the West and the East, not only U.S. but also European, to engage and work on major issues together. Right now, it's evolved into, it's got many other countries that belong to it. Its focus is really on systems analysis is a tool looking at all kinds of issues, environmental, economic, social, demography, and so on, and a lot of very good people, and they bring young scholars there. Anyway, the IASA is led an effort to include a lot of international scientists. It just came out this past summer with, I think, a very good report called The World in 2050. So it's sort of looking at what are the big issues the world has to deal with, particularly related to having a more sustainable world on all the social, economic, environmental aspects. But what are the major transformations that have to occur to enable us to sort of chart the course where we're going to be successful? And they laid out 6, but one of them is they labeled as the digital technologies, and they put again, look, I think it was broader than just digital, all of the revolution that's occurring in the biological sciences and elsewhere. But they called it the Digital Anthropocene. Anthropocene is a word that's come up. We have these different geologic epochs of the world, and now the Anthropocene is supposed to be the epoch where everything is dominated by human beings, that they really control the whole planet. And in this report, the IASA coined the term the Digital Anthropocene, that if you think the Anthropocene is really significant, wait till you combine it with all of these new capabilities that are coming from digital technology. So,
leads me back to what you said earlier about this facial recognition in China. What are your thoughts on that? Do you have any?
Well, obviously China is exploiting artificial intelligence and these technologies as a way to control society. So I think democratic countries of the world have to, that's a major issue that we have to think about and to deal with. I was just involved in meetings in Japan, and what I was advocating there was that call them the advanced maritime democracies in the Indo-Pacific region. So that includes Japan, the United States, Australia, New Zealand, India. China has made these plans where they want to dominate the high-tech industries of the future. They have a lot of smart people. They're putting massive investments in science and technology. I was advocating that the maritime democracies, the countries in particular that I mentioned, we have to move faster in terms of science, technology, innovation, and to show the Chinese that the more open, bottom-up type innovative ecosystems in our countries can move faster than the authoritarian top-down approach. I have a number of friends who are very good scientists in China, many of them educated in the United States after the opening. And right now they can't speak freely in China. But when they think no one can listen to them when they're outside of China, they're really worried that they really viewed the U.S. as the main bulwark that was helping move China towards what some kind of called liberal, rules-based international order. And then they've seen with, the recent political developments in the U.S. and occurring in Europe. So that, plus the fact that China recently has turned more authoritarian and more controlling, that they're very distressed by that, but they don't know what they can do about it. And the fact that the government is going to use all of these technologies essentially the way to control society is, I think, is a significant challenge.
Really, really interesting. So for our listeners out there that are, thinking about careers and potentially really interested in science and also politics, what's your recommendation as far as how to follow a path similar to yours?
Yeah, I meet with a lot of students, graduate students, undergraduate students at universities, particularly when I'm talking about the role of science and technology for the Sustainable Development Goals. And that's when young people are very idealistic in many cases, and they get very excited about this, trying to think how can they use their expertise, to advance this sort of agenda and make the world a better place. So there's a great interest by not only young scientists, but from different engineering, from social sciences, humanities, and trying to think about, okay, how can I use my expertise also to advance these broad societal goals on the suite, sort of the one planet kind of ideas. I mentioned that fellowship program that the American Association of Advancement of Science has for giving this 2-year fellowship experience for a young scientist to experience what it's like working in the government or in the U.S. State Department, the Foreign Ministry. So a number of other countries are trying to create similar programs like that. So I think there's a tremendous appetite for young people to essentially see if they can do two things at the same time, both be very good in depth in whatever field they've chosen to do, but at the same time spend some of their energies in trying to do these broader societal things. And so I think there are ways to do that. You can, in my case, I sort of went from one side, I moved totally my career out of straight science into this interface of science and policy. I think there are a number of very good scientists who stay deeply rooted in science, but they spend part of their time, like some of the mentors that I had, working on issues like arms control with Russian and Soviet scientists. Now there are a number of countries and their foreign ministries have created science advisors to their foreign ministers, so that sort of idea is catching on too. So I think there are a lot of opportunities for scientists, whether they're deeply rooted as academics or in scientific research, but also to have make contributions in this other area. And it's also, I think, a good place, as I mentioned, for this fellowship program. A number of the scientists have essentially switched their careers. They've either continued working in the U.S. government or they've gone into non-governmental organizations in Washington and elsewhere that really focus on this science policy interface.
It's so fascinating. I find it fascinating that at the end of the day, you just followed your heart, whatever your heart was. It's like I really was intrigued in science, but then I also wanted to impact the world. And I think that's the message that we definitely want to tell people out there is whatever you decide to do, follow your heart and it'll all work out at the end of the day. I really thank you for the conversation. I know there's so many things you've done throughout your career that has impacted us as a society. And I want to thank you for that as well. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.